This evening we continue our study in the book of Hebrews. We are in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be looking at verses 23 through 40 tonight. That's quite a lot. And we're going to be considering faith that overcomes the world. And we ask the question, what kind of faith leads to preservance of the soul? And we talked a little bit about that, or we'll talk about that, down in verse 39. It says in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 39, "But we are not those who shrink back in destruction, but of those who have faith in the persevering of the soul," preserving of the soul. You know, we've talked about faith that pleases God. Back up here in chapter 11 in verses 1 through 10, we talked about faith that worships like Abel, that walks like Enoch, and works like Noah. And we can have confidence and conviction in the things hoped for, the things unseen. And we believe that God is the great rewarder of those who seek Him. And it is that faith that embraces the promise, as we've seen back in chapter 11, verses 8 through 22, that obeying God when He calls, even if it means sojourning as a pilgrim or sacrificing that which is most precious to us, like Abraham did, or receiving strength from God to do His will, as Sarah did, or declare the promises of God from generation to generation, as we have seen in Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. This saving faith that overcomes the world is that which concerns us, that which we need to adhere to, because we face the obstacles set forth by Satan in this world that we must overcome. The Apostle John wrote in 1 John chapter 5, starting in verse 4, "For whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith." And then he notes, who is the one who overcomes the world? But he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. And within the context of Hebrews chapter 11, beginning here in verse 23 and going down to verse 40, we have a multiplicity of examples. As we look in this last half of the chapter, we're reminded how in the Old Testament those with faith were able to overcome the world. Whatever came between them and God, they could overcome it. And so we too can overcome the world. As we begin in verse 23 of Hebrews chapter 11, we find faith in the generations of the Exodus. Before the children of Israel finally had opportunity to leave Egypt, we see the faith of Moses' parents. In verse 23, it says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edicts." You know, they hid Moses for 3 months. And you can go back over to Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and it talks about that. It talks about Pharaoh's edict over in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 22. Of all of these children that were to be murdered, cast into the Nile River, literally, because of the fear that they had in the people. It also notes here that he was a beautiful child. And that notes that he was good, that he was not an ordinary child. He was one that was born with the specific thing in which he was to do. And it was their faith that gave them courage to withstand the king's edicts. And it was just a small beginning, but by faith, They overcame the world. They overcame Egypt. Moses also noted that faith. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. In Hebrews chapter 11, beginning there in verse 24, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. He chose the affliction, the suffering, like God's people, rather than the sins of temporal pleasure. When we think about that, all the things in the world was subject to him. If he would have just said, yes, I am Pharaoh's son. But he did not. He was looking to a greater reward. He was confident in the things hoped for, that heavenly reward. He also forsook Egypt. In verse 27 of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, and seeing him who is unseen. He wasn't afraid of the wrath of the king. He was more afraid of the invisible God. And through faith, he endured. He had conviction in the things unseen, the things in God. And he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood. There in verse 28, it says, by faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. He believed in the warning given by God. And we see that over in Exodus chapter 12, starting there in verse 1 and going down to verse 30. He had Israel sprinkle the blood of the lamb on the lintels and the doorpost. And by faith, Moses overcame the world. Moses overcame the Egyptian bondage, not only for himself, but also for the nation of Israel. They passed through the sea. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 29, it says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. You know, I would suggest that most of those people, whenever they got up to the Red Sea, they thought, oh man, we're in trouble. Because the Egyptian army was behind them. They were coming to take them back into slavery, into captivity. But the sea was opened, and they were able to pass through on dry land. Over in Exodus chapter 14, going down to verse 21, it talks about that. It says, when Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind at night, and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. The sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on the right hand and on the left. Can you just imagine? Here it is, this sea. And overnight you have this great divide. Now, we're not talking about 200 or 300 people. We're talking about thousands of people going through here. And you've all seen the little cartoon about the little boy going along on this, and he's plucking the fish out of the wall. Y'all seen that cartoon? That's kind of a cute cartoon. But the problem was that the army was still behind them. And in Exodus 14, starting in verse 23, it talks about the Egyptians who perished in the sea. In verse 23, it said, then the Egyptians took up pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. They said, it's open. We're going through. We're We're going to make it across. But the problem was that God was not going to allow them to be overtaken. Drop down to verse 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and over their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. Then the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And all the chariots, all that army, all the horsemen, they were entirely engulfed. They were gone because of the sea. That's faith. To go through there to begin with. Because God took care of them. We also know of the faith of these individuals whenever they got to the city of Jericho. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 30 it says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. And we can go over to Joshua chapter 6 verses 1 through 20. And it talks about them walking around the city for 7 days. 13 times. They encircled the city, showing their faith in God rather than in their own military might. Now, can you imagine? Whenever you're told that even though you have a great army, go out and march around this city. Go out and march around that for 7 days. And you got out there and you blew your horns and you marched around and you had your call and the whole thing. And finally, they overcame the world. The Egyptians, they overcame the Palestinians. Jericho fell. But inside, there was Rahab, the harlot. And it says in verse 31 of Hebrews chapter 11, by faith Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. You go over Joshua chapter 2, Joshua chapter 6. She had received the spies from Israel and had received them in peace. She was helping them. And because of that, and because of her faith, she did not perish with those within the city walls. By faith, Rahab overcame the world of sin, world of unbelief. And through faith, Isaac received the promised land as God had told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob over in Joshua chapter 21. In the process, by faith, they overcame what obstacles that was placed before them. Even a Gentile like Rahab became a recipient of the promise of her faith. But the need of faith did not stop there. As they entered into the promised land, they had to have that faith. And he denotes here, beginning in verse 11, a list of the heroes of faith. And it says, and what more shall I say? For a time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. There was not enough time for the writer to describe the faith of all of these individuals in detail. Judges like Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. King like David, prophets like Samuel, and the rest of them. What the author does is provide a summary of their accomplishments that was brought about through faith. Through faith, people such as these, it denotes in verse 33, conquers kingdoms, performs acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword from weakness, were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to the flight. The conquering kingdoms. Joshua conquered Palestine. Joshua chapter 12, verses 7 through 24. David in conquering the neighboring nations. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 4 through 25, and also chapter 8, verses 1 through 14. They performed acts of righteousness. Samuel as judge, 1 Samuel 12:4. David as king, in 2 Samuel 8:15. And Solomon as king, in chapter 3, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 28. And they obtained that great promise, that great nation. In Joshua 21, it gives us some insight on that, as well as in chapter 23. They shut the mouth of lions. Noted that Samson did so in Judges 14:6. And David protecting sheep in 1 Samuel 7, verses 34 and 37. And of course, Daniel in the lion's den in Daniel chapter 6, verses 21 and 22. They also quenched the power of fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Daniel chapter 3, verses 23 through 25. They escaped the edge of the sword. David fleeing from King Saul in 1 Samuel 23, 19 through 29. Elijah fleeing Jezebel, 1 Kings 19, 8 through 10. Elisha, who the king of Israel wanted murdered, 2 Kings 6, 31 through 32. From weakness, they were made strong. Samson after his hair was cut off. Judges chapter 16, 29 through 30. And Hezekiah, who was given 15 years of life, in Isaiah 38, 1 through 8. They became mighty in war. David in defeating Goliath in 1 Samuel 17:50. Jehoshaphat in defeating Edom, 2 Chronicles 20. And Hezekiah, whose faith led to the slaughter of 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in 2 Kings 19, 1 through 36. Now, here in a bit, Linda's going to say, I didn't get all of those written down. When we're going to go back to what was previously said, we just don't have time to read every one of those tonight. So I'm going to take the writer of Hebrews at his word. It was also through faith, as we see in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35, that the women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might offer a better resurrection. And others experienced mocking and scourging, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. The women received back their dead by resurrection. The widow of Zarephath via Elijah in 1 Kings 17, verses 17 through 24. The Shunammite woman via Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 37. And these events would have been well known to the Hebrew readers. They would have understood those kind of things. Others were tortured, not accepting their release so that they might obtain a better resurrection. Eleazar in the Maccabean period between the Testaments. Also the 7 brothers and their mothers tortured by Antiochus Epiphanes. Again, in that same 400-year period between the Testaments. Others experienced mockings, scourgings. Also chains and imprisonments. We think about Micaiah the prophet in 1 Kings 22, verses 24 through 28. We think about Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 20, chapter 37, chapter 38. There were those that were stoned to death. Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. 2 Chronicles 24, 20 through 22. The prophets of Isaiah, according to tradition, were sawn in two. Daniel, as a youth, was tempted. Daniel chapter 1, 8 through 21. Uriah the prophet was put to death by the sword. Jeremiah chapter 26, 20 through 23. And some just wandered. They were destitute. Whenever we talk about they went about in sheepskin and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, they were outcast. They were the low of the low. And we see Elijah in 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 8. Also in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 2 through 6, and 18, 9 through 10. What these people received by their faith was not praise from the world. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 38, it says, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in the deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. They were outcast. They were thrown away. They were useless to the populace. Many of them wandered in the desert and the mountains, lived in caves and dens. Elijah was one of those. But in truth, when we think about it, the world was not worthy of them. When the world looked down on them, deeming them to be unworthy. But they gained approval because they never gave up. They always had their faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39, it says, and all these having gained approval through their faith. No matter what they faced in this world, they were always faithful to God. We see that back in chapter 11 and verse 2 of Hebrews, where the old men gained approval. Talking about those that were the elders here. And it's because of their faith. Now remember the struggle that was going on as this Hebrew writer was writing this, with those trying to go back. And he's just illustrating, look at what all of these people have done in the past. And they kept their faith. No matter what's going on in your life, keep the faith. And this is stated in regard to Enoch. Back in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 5. It says, by faith Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. They did not obtain the promise during their lifetime, but yet they were faithful. They were looking for something else, something better. As we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39, the second part of verse 39 says, they did not receive what was promised because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. They didn't receive the promised land until later. But they did receive a promise. They lived for Jesus. They received a better promise. It was something that was coming. It was going to be delivered. And it was Christ Jesus our Lord. We know, as we've studied previously, that the law could not make them perfect. In Hebrews chapter 9 and also in Hebrews chapter 10, but Christ can. Christ can make us perfect. And what they did not receive during their lifetime, They did with the coming of Christ. For Jesus died to redeem them as well as for us. They're now made perfect, just as we who are faithful. And when we think about the spirit of just men becoming perfect, we are made perfect only through Christ Jesus. Through faith, all of these individuals overcame the world. Sometimes it was their victory, often it was not. But the ultimate victory of all of these individuals is that they died in faith. And now they enjoy the fruit of faith, the bliss and the presence of the Lamb. And through faith, we too can overcome the world. Faith in Jesus as the Son of God will give us the victory. Victory over the world's temptations, victory over the world's persecutions. The victories we win may not be as impressive as those listed in this chapter, but if we are faithful unto death, we will have victory. Revelation 2:10. This chapter, a chapter of heroes of faith, should serve to motivate us to grow in our faith, to please God, to embrace the promise. And whatever comes our way, no matter what kind of difficulty, any of the things that have been listed in this chapter, or whatever else may come our way, dear friends, as God's children, if we are faithful, we will overcome the world. We may not win the praise of it, but we will overcome it. And that is the faith that leads to saving the soul. If there's a need here this evening, I encourage you to allow us to assist you however we may. Please, come now, as together we stand and as we sing.